Hi, my name's Mason Hawthorne. I write horror and weird fiction, and this is my story, Darlin, You're My World, which was published by Satira Press as part of the anthology Monsters We Forgot, Part 3. So, Darlin, You're My World. The road is smooth and unfurls through the dusty fields in a dead straight line. The moon is yellow as a toenail, and the stars flash like chips of glass in the bruised sky. Crackling and fading, the radio keeps on playing, pub rock classics interspersed with a strident nasal disc jockey who keeps using words like hip and stylin' and trying to flirt with the folks who call in on the requests line. One blunt, square hand rests on top of the steering wheel, thick fingers drumming along to an independent rhythm. The driver bobs his head along to his own tune, and he hums off-key, eyes staring into the middle distance out over the endless blank of the road and the night sky, fixed on the point ahead where the headlights peter out. Now and then he cuts his eyes across the passenger seat. "You're my world, darlin'," he croons, bobbing his head along. "You're my world, darlin'." In the passenger seat, Darling is as insubstantial as a bundle of sticks. Her dark, glossy head lolls against the window, and in the moonlight her eyes are pits in her skull. Her cheekbones stand out sharp as knives, and every slight bump on the road jostles her. Even with a towel carefully tucked around her shoulders, she knocks against the window with each pothole. The rumble thump of the wheels barreling over, followed by the sharp crack of her head against the glass. "You're my world, darling," he repeats with terse finality, and then subsides again to the driver's view, eyes watery. His left hand is in his lap, and he rubs his thumb over his fingertips, feeding the last greasy trace of yesterday's dinner there still. In his head, he's calculating how far there is to go yet, how long the tank is going to last. Calling up memories of the terrain to figure out where the next service station is, and whether he can risk pulling into it, or if he should wait a little while longer, let the road spool out and behind them a little while more. Either side, the dusty fields rustle with dry grasses. Rusty, barbed wire fences tangled round with dead weeds blur into near indistinguishable lines in the dark. Now and then he spots the hunched figures of roos bounding along the fence lines, and he whistles and crosses his fingers, hoping they don't turn out in front of him. He puts his foot down in the hopes he can outrun their suicidal animal panic, so that by the time they realize they're spooked, he's already shot past and disappeared into the night. Lights ahead. A moment's hesitation, and then he slams on the brakes. The tires squeal and the car fishtails, judders and slips to a halt, the engine whining with the strain. "Okay," he says. "Okay, darling, all right." He shifts the gears back, crunching and clunking until he finds the right one, and hauls the wheel to turn them off. The servo is so bright against everything else, stark, white and chrome. The flashing red of the ice sign catches his eye, and he finds himself blinking back tears, the light too much after so long. For so long his stomach growls, and he glances over at her. Guilt wells up in his gut, and he feels a whine at the back of his throat. He wasn't thinking, was he? He just drove and drove. There's a semi-trailer filling up on one side, and he pulls into the petrol pump and pops the tank cover. Whoever owned the car before kept it shiny and clean and full. Now the paintwork is dusty and the wipers are clogged with red mud. The neat rolls of coins that were in the ashtray were all used up on meat pies and cans for the road. He hops out, leaning down to look at her one last time before he starts the petrol pumping. The truckie comes out, tucking his wallet away in his pocket. His eyes slide over the driver at the pump, over the dusty car, and then his step falters. He turns mid-stride and almost stumbles, walks towards the car like he's not exactly sure why. He gets to the passenger side, and his mouth hangs open, and a runner of spittle falls down his chin and stains the front of his navy singlet. He looks up to the driver, who just stares and stares. The petrol pump clicks. Carefully, the truckie opens the driver's side door and crouches down. He leans into Darling, and there's a wet smack and a groan. The driver scuffs his foot against the ground. He finds the squeegee and cleans his windscreen, and then the back window. It won't last an hour once they start again, but it's something to keep him busy. The truckie collapses on the concrete beside the car, and the driver hurries around to the passenger door. He unclips the seatbelt and picks her up, settles her on his hip the way he'd carry a small child. Her head is heavy, and it falls against his shoulder. He moves her arm around his own neck, and the thought of her holding him fills his heart to bursting with love. Inside the servo is white, burning light. His eyes smart in water, and he resists the urge to shield her milky eyes. Fluorescents don't worry her, and he knows it, but he can't stop fussing. At the counter, he sees the kid in his crumpled uniform take a look, and then a double take. There's a moment of panic. His hand shakes as he reaches for something under the counter, the button maybe, and then he freezes, trembling like a moth's wing, and his jaw goes slack. He watches her. He only has eyes for her. It's almost enough to make the driver puff up with pride. He's the one who's taking her, driving her across the vast wasteland of the country, making sure she has everything she needs. She's my world, my whole world, he says. And he doesn't know if the kid hears him, but it doesn't matter. He puts her up on the counter, her arms stretch out, her head droops like a late season bloom. The kid bends down to her, and then he's choking on something, and his tanned fingers look so dark against the chalky white of her skin. The driver can't take his eyes off them, but he leans over the counter, punches the right button so the cash drawer pops open. Lucky, lucky. It's late, and the drawer is bursting with 50s. He grabs handfuls of them and stuffs them in his pocket, and he takes a minute to grab up food, more pies and sauce packets, and a few bottles of soft drink. Chips and a mess of other stuff. He shoves it in a bag with a chain logo printed on the side and gathers her back from the countertop. The kid is lying there, his hands reaching out over the plastic, a stupid look on his face, mouth wide, eyes bulging. The driver hitches her on his hip and heads back to the car. Tenderly, he sets her in the passenger seat, arranges the towels around her frail shoulders, wads up one to try and protect her head. When there's no more he can do, he closes the door and goes back around to settle into the driver's seat. He takes a minute to peel open a pie wrapper and eats it while he starts the car. The engine grumbles to life, and he rolls forward. There's a bump as the back wheel goes over one of the truckie's limbs, and then they're peeling back out onto the road. Setting, the moon looks fatter than ever. The sky is beginning to turn grey in the east, and the driver keeps up a watch for the motor inn or a hotel or a pub with rooms to rent. Worst comes to worst, he'll roll into the boot with her. It'll be cooking in the midday sun, but that's still better than the alternative. As the light grows, he can see her better. The dark fall of her hair, razor angles of her features, her fine bird-boned body. Her milky eyes roll and he burns, knowing she's looking back at him. His heart skips a beat and he holds his breath. Her head shifts a little, tilting to the side, and her tongue hangs out, fat and red as a cabochon ruby. Bloody drool runs down her chin and falls, drip, drip, drip across her lap. The driver puts his foot down, roaring up the road, racing the sun, and he hums to himself and mumbles, "Darlin, oh darling, my world, my world." And that's the end.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing your story with us, Mason. That was amazing.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So I guess everyone, this is part of our new series of author interviews and readings. And it was sort of Mason's idea, so he's the first one to do it. So basically, we're going to have the reading and then a couple of questions about our author's writing and about the stories in particular. So these are the things that I would like to know about, if I may ask. So the first one was just sort of a little bit of an introduction to your writing, I guess, more generally. So when did you start? Where are you published? What kind of things do you work on?
Yeah, so I studied writing at the University of Wollongong. I graduated in 2015 after I did my honours degree. And I actually had my first few stories published last year. I've had a couple in some podcasts and a few in some short story anthologies. And yeah, so I write a lot of horror, body horror, dark and weird fantasy stuff. Yeah, and I'm working on a novel at the moment, which is more of a secondary world fantasy, sort of inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
So would you say that in terms of you're working in the genre of horror and body horror particularly, is it something that you've been interested in your whole life and you're sort of working within that genre with sort of quite a deep knowledge of that genre and reworking it in some ways? Or how would you relate to the genre more widely, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, like I always loved horror movies. Like as a kid, I could like when I'd been put to bed after my bedtime, I could peep through from my room through to the living room and watch horror movies that my parents were watching. So I probably watched a lot of stuff that I maybe shouldn't have, but I loved it. And so like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, like all of the sort of classic horror stuff, Alien. And sort of growing up, I read sort of unceasingly. I would sit down and read a book a day if I had my choice of. And so, like, I sort of burned through a lot of Stephen King stuff. I think I started reading Stephen King when I was 12, and I read probably uh, my mum had probably 15 Stephen King novels lying around, so I read all of those. And and yeah, I got into the Hannibal Lecter series about 14, sort of, and it's just yeah, every sort of stage of my life, I've been reading horror or watching horror, getting into that, and I think a lot of what I do, not in this story probably, but a lot of what I do is writing horror and body horror that has more overtly queer themes in it. Yeah, so that's probably the direction that I'm going with it.
Do you find it a particularly useful mode to kind of investigate queer identity or queer issues, or is it just because you like it so much that you use it?
I think it's one of those things. Like if you have a theme you want to discuss and you have a mode that you enjoy, you're gonna find how it intersects. I think it is useful because, like, historically, there's been a lot of queer coding of horror. Villains and sort of monsters and things are quite often queer coded. So it becomes kind of exciting to take that back and say, like, yes, actually, I am a monster, and this is what I'm going to do about it. Like, um, being able to tell those stories, and sort of the freedom of being able to go, like, yeah, okay, you're going to call us monstrous. Okay, let's play in that space. Let's find out what we can do with it. Rather than having to sort of protest your innocence or like prove that you're not some freak or a monster. Like okay, I I think that's fun. I think it's, yeah, sure, I'll be a monster. Let's go, sort of thing.
Fair enough. So you said like this book, this story is a bit more unusual because it's not so overtly
Mm.
queer, I suppose. I mean, what was your inspiration for this story? And particularly, I'm probably interested in your vampire lore.
Yeah. So there were two sort of main things that led to me writing this story. I was part of a writing group. So once a month we'd meet up and we would have a theme that we would have to write a short story for. So I think the theme was "Darling, You're My World," or it was just "You're My World," and I added the "darling." Um, and then was just online, and I saw this discussion thread about someone was saying they didn't like vampires as a concept because apex predators generally only have one strength. They've maxed out the stats in one advantage. Like, cheetahs are super fast, but they're not exactly strong. Um, lions are sort of strong, but they're not super fast. Like, but vampires, they're, super strength, super speed. They can hypnotize you. They can do anything that you can imagine. So I thought, like, that's a really interesting sort of challenge. What's the scariest thing that vampires can do? Like, what do I think is the scariest thing about vampires is they can hypnotize you and make you their thrall. And so I thought, well, okay, we'll make it an apex predator. So it's only got one strength, and that's the scariest one. So the only thing it can do is convince you that your only purpose in life is to serve it. And so that's where this story came from. It's a vampire that can't walk or move or defend itself or do any of the things that I would generally associate with a vampire in fiction. All it can do is that anyone who looks at it instantly falls in love with it and has to do whatever it takes to serve it. And yeah, that's where that story came from.
So how do you interpret the relationship between the two protagonists? Is it one sort of simply a one-sided enthrallment, I guess?
Um, I'll be honest, when I was writing about it, I didn't really think about, or okay, I don't think that the vampire really has any feelings for the walking hamburgers that carry it around and take care of it. Um, the thing that's interesting to me is, and I brought this up to the group I was writing with because they all said like, oh, it's a dude and the vampire's a girl. And I said, well, no, the vampire is whatever it needs to be for the dude to love it. So if he is heterosexual, like he sees this vampire and he goes, oh, it's a beautiful girl and I'm in love with her.
Mm.
And so like I think that in that space where the vampire becomes like, in your mind as you're enthralled by the vampire, it takes on whatever characteristic it takes for you to be enthralled by it. So I mean, there is a little bit of queerness in the edges of this one, but if you take it from a straight reading, like reading what's in the text, it's not like overt. But yeah. So because it's focalized through the driver, we only have his word that the vampire is female or beautiful, or like because we don't really like in the description. It's like it's on the one hand described as a bundle of sticks and like a skull, but on the other hand he's saying how beautiful she is and all of this. So it's like there is some sort of like he's not a reliable narrator because he's in this condition of being subsumed to the vampire's will.
Interesting. I mean, like, yeah, I think there was a juxtaposition for me between how beautiful he kept saying the vampire was and the imagery of the tongue at the end, particularly, I think, in the bloody drawl. Not the sexy vampire that we're used to from.
No, but different strokes for different folks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. We're going to put some links below to Mason's other work, I think, and his website. So thank you for coming, and I will finish the recording, and good night, ghouls.
All right.